divine punishment through natural calamities or subjugation by companions. When you read the Quran, you cannot miss an expression of the Quran, which is Sunnatullah. Now the interesting thing is that the word, the expression Sunnah, as is known to us Muslims, is not what the Quran means when it uses the word Sunnah. We by Sunnah normally mean Sunnatu Rasulillah, the Sunnah, the religious practices of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. But the Quran mentions Sunnatullah, the practices of the Almighty. That is, God Almighty has declared that He has certain policies, which the way God has always dealt with whatever He has done in this world, those practices are consistently applied. One of those practices, one of those Sunnatullah, the Quran mentions is that whenever God sent, and I'm using the past tense because there are no further prophets coming, whenever God sent His messengers, Rasul, to this world, inviting people of a particular nation, and the nation rejected their messenger, that nation met with God's punishment in this very life. This is one of those sunnahs which the Quran mentions never gets violated. So we read in the Quran over and over again these stories of messengers. By the way, when I am using the expression messenger, I am actually translating Rasul. There is another word, Nabi, which people can translate differently, but I translate it as prophet to distinguish it from Rasul. What is the difference between a Nabi and a Rasul? All humans, all men, whom God chose to communicate, deliver His revelation to them, for them to deliver that message to the people, all such chosen men are called Nabi, the plural of which is Anbiya. Within this superset, call it, of Anbiya, there is a subset called Rasul, the plural of which is Rasul, which I translate as messengers. In other words, all Rasul, all messengers are Anbiya, prophets, but all prophets are not necessarily Rasul. Rasul or messengers are a small subset of Anbiya. If the Hadith tradition which refers to this particular understanding is correct, then there were 124,000 prophets, Anbiya, from within which there were 313 Rasul, messengers. What is the difference? It's one of those unfortunate things that have happened, wherein our textbooks carry a certain understanding of what a Rasul is as against a Nabi. And once something finds a place in a textbook, and I've seen that not just textbook, once a concept finds a place in a book, printed book, somehow many people have this understanding that this is the final word, even though it's just a way of communicating. Normally I have seen that people think that the prophets who received God's books in Sharia are Rasul. I mean, if you read the Quran, that's not true. I mean, Dawood alayhi salam had a book, Zabur, but he was not a Rasul. And Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Shuaib alayhi salam were all clearly Rasul, but there is no mention anywhere that they had books or Sharia. What is the difference then? Well, the difference between the two is, as you can see from the Quranic mention, that Rasul are those Nabi who, when they come to their nation, their respective nations, they come with a very clear mandate. They tell their people right from day one, you believe in the message that I have brought and you succeed, not just in the next life, but in this life as well. Or, conversely, you reject the message that I have brought and you will be doomed, not just in the next life, but in this life as well. These people who come with this mandate, clear understanding, warning from the Almighty, have been described as Rasul, messengers. Anbiya, we know the Quran mentions about some Anbiya of the children of Israel, accusing those children, يَقْتُلُونَ النَّبِيِّينَ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ. They killed prophets unjustifiably. Zakaria, Yahya alayhi salam, the father and the son, the prophets, great prophets, got killed. Nothing happened. Why? Well, that's not my subject right now. But this is a reality which you would find mentioned in the Quran. And what you also cannot miss if you are a reader of the Quran is the fact that the Almighty has mentioned the stories of 6 messengers in particular over and over and over again. And, you know, there are people who ask, and rightly so, justifiably, was it not enough for a story to have been mentioned once? I mean, what is the point that a book that was meant to be the guidance for the entire mankind for all times to come, and relatively speaking, not a very huge volume, is mentioning the same stories again? Is it not unnecessary repetition? You know, sometimes some people say that, you know, if you raise questions, this is wrong, and you should be respectful and just read it. This is God's word. For God's sake, how are you going to understand? The Almighty is urging you to reflect and ponder, understand and see that God has no contradictions. This is God's word. So, when you have these questions in your mind, you are worried to find answers to them. But if you're not worried and you're not seeking answers, well, then you are reciting and reading, and good luck to you. But obviously, the deeper meanings would never emerge to embrace you. I'll tell you what the reason is. And in that reason, you will hopefully find the solution to the problem that we are faced with today. The problem of belligerent, militant Islam. The reason why the Almighty has mentioned these stories over and over again is what you find in the very mentions that are there in the Quran. Each time the Almighty mentions these stories, He says, at the end of the prophetic mission, there was one punishment or the other that visited the nation that rejected the messengers, and they were destroyed. And this is what God always does. He always does. The 6 messengers whose stories have been repeated over and over again are Nuh, Hud, Saleh, Lut, Shuaib, Musa alayhi salam. The Quran mentions in Surah Al-Mujadila, the 58th surah of the Quran, verses 20 and 21. The Almighty says that those who oppose the messengers and God, Inna allazina yuhadduna Allah wa Rasulah, they are going to meet with ignominy, insult, and punishment. Katab Allah, God has written it down. This expression means that God has decided. God has made it a point. La ghlibanna, that I am going to prevail. Ana wa rusuli, I and my messengers. I am not going to allow anyone to subjugate my messengers, to weaken them and to prevail over them. This is what the Almighty has mentioned in a number of surahs. Honestly, if you read the Quran, you can't miss it. It's mentioned so many times. And if you read them so many times and you don't have this question, why this repetition, and worry about it. But I'll tell you that there was a wrong conclusion that some people draw. And that is again a problem, When you don't come up with the right answers, then you have got to go for the wrong answers. But before that, let me say that in Surah Araf, the 7th chapter of the Quran, from verses 59 to 93, there are stories of Nuh alayhi salam, Hud alayhi salam, Saleh alayhi salam, Lut alayhi salam, and Shuaib alayhi salam, in considerable details, followed by a description of the Almighty's principle, that in each of these stories, in each of the cases of these messengers, there was a pattern that was followed. God sent the messengers, they delivered the message, people rejected, and then He caused them to go through difficulties, tribulations, so that they realize that what they did was wrong. At times, verbal communication is not effective. Well, my experience is most of the time. So you need to have something else, and that something else is also always provided by the Almighty when it comes to the case of the messengers' nations. So He caused them to go through circumstances which, if an honest person would go through, would start wondering as to why is it happening? Have we done something wrong? So that they realize. So this is what is mentioned in verses 94 to 102. Followed by a very longish passage from 103 to 171 of the description of the story of Musa alayhi salam, which again is broken into 2 parts. One wherein he addressed Pharaoh and his companions, and they ultimately were punished by being drowned. Followed by the story of Musa alayhi salam with the children of Israel who believed in him and accompanied him. This is, if you look at the Quran, a very long passage. And obviously, as I said, the question arises, why these stories? Followed by Surah number 10, Surah Yunus, verse 25 to verse 104. The same 6 messengers, their stories repeated. The messenger came, delivered the message, the arrogant leaders rejected them, caused them to suffer, persecuted them, and ultimately the Almighty's punishment visited them. 26th chapter, Surah Shu'ara, verse 10 to verse 191. The same theme, except for the fact that there is one prominent addition, which is the addition of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Quite often there are people who think that his nation never got the ignominy of being punished. But the Quran mentions that it happened. It is another matter that the Almighty chose not to mention that punishment in detail, as He has mentioned in the case of the other 6 nations. Followed by Surah 29, Al-Ankabut, where the Almighty mentions these stories from 14 verse to 40. And in verse 40, the Almighty has summarized the different forms of punishments that were utilized, employed by the Almighty to get rid of the nations who arrogantly spurned the message of the Almighty that came to them through messengers. Storms of stones, blasts from the sky, earth swallowing, and people getting drowned. So these were some of the forms of punishment that these nations faced. Followed by another surah, a relatively smaller, shorter surah, Surah Al-Qamar. If some of you are familiar with the Quran would know that there are some surahs that have verses which are repeated. The most prominent amongst them is Surah Rahman. فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. But there is another prominent surah, which is Surah Al-Qamar, which relatively short surah, has a verse repeated 4 times. وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We have made the Quran very appropriate, easy, for the purpose of getting reminded. Is there anybody who is prepared to be reminded? فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. Is there anyone who wants to understand? So this surah, interestingly, a brief short surah, talks about the same story of Nuh alayhi salam, Hud alayhi salam, Saleh alayhi salam, Lut alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam. Some relatively longer in description, others shorter. And God has His own ways. One messenger, Shuaib alayhi salam, is prominently missing in this description. But what is very significant is that the Almighty mentions in verse 43 of this surah, Surah 54 Al-Qamar, and verse 43, which immediately follows the description of the story of the messengers. And you know what it says? It says, أَكُفَّارُكُمْ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أُولَٰئِكُمْ. Believers, are your unbelievers, kuffar, any better than their predecessors, the earlier ones? Am lakum bara'atun fi zubur. Or do they have immunity in scriptures? You get the point? The Quran is saying that while the people who rejected the message coming to them through their messengers from God, they were punished in one form or another. How on earth is it possible that these unbelievers, Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, are going to be spared? Are they any better than the earlier ones? Or do they have immunity written in some scriptures that even though the earlier people who rejected the messengers were destroyed, these people are not going to be destroyed? No, that's not the case. They're going to be destroyed. Why? Because God is consistent. And that is what actually gives us a clue to know why the Quran repeats these stories over and over again. Why? Because there was a nation that was about to be destroyed. The Almighty, the kind, the merciful, wanted them to be warned enough for them to rescue themselves from the imminent danger of punishment. So it is as if he is urging them, don't go there. Stop there. Don't you know? It has happened so many times before. You know those stories. In some of the cases, you go past those places where the destroyed ruins of those nations you can witness. And yet you are not opening your eyes. This is what the Quran is telling to the people of Mecca and its surroundings, urging them to believe and warning them that if they don't, they'll have to face the consequences. And they and only they are going to be blamed for it. This is what the Quran has mentioned in its text regarding the nations that are visited by the messengers. As I mentioned in the earlier part of this presentation, in Surah Al-Mujadila, the Almighty has mentioned the rule, the principle, the detailed description of which are these stories. You know what the Quran says about itself? The style of its presentation. The Quran says it's a book, uhkimat ayatuhu, thumma fussilat. The Quran is a book whose verses are muhkam, brief, comprehensive, like precis, you know. And then they are uhkimat fussilat. They are described in detail. Min ladun alimin hakim. From the one who is knowledgeable, from the one who is wise. And you know, that makes you clear in your understanding that the same principle which was mentioned in brief is described in detail. It is as if you have been given the experience of a seed, and then you also see the trunk and the tree and the branches emerging from it. That's what the Quran is. You read it, you understand it, and you start loving it. And you start telling yourself, my goodness, oh God, this is from you. Nobody else can do it. So the principle that the Almighty mentioned was, Katab Allah, God has written it down. La ghlibanna, I am going to dominate. Ana wa rusuli, I and my messengers. And the details of which are mentioned in the stories that he narrated. But as I said, one mention should have been enough. But no, it wasn't a mention of law. It wasn't that the Almighty was just mentioning that, for example, you have to punish the thieves. It was a mention of a reality that, if not properly appreciated and realized, would have caused a nation to be destroyed. So that nation was warned over and over again, and the end result is that we find that the Quran is replete with these stories, at times in detail, at times briefly, so that if on one occasion you miss it out, on the other you get it. You know, it quite often happens that we're not very attentive sometimes. So a different style, a different way of presentation might appeal to you. So, the Almighty did as best as was possible to make sure that if at all there was anyone prepared to know and understand what the truth was, he or she should wake up and embrace faith. And that is exactly what happened, you know. Over the years, there were people who gradually woke up from time to time, and only those people were left who didn't deserve to survive. And the Almighty, He mentioned, and I'll talk about it in the next session, that this punishment that the Almighty has been warning these people against could come to them in two different ways. It could either come in the form of natural calamities, as was the case with most of the earlier nations, Primarily because of the reason that the companions of the messengers were very few in number. So that's what the Almighty's decision is. They are few, then He has other ways of dispensing justice. He used natural calamities. Everything is in His control. But if the companions of the messengers are large in number, then He would punish the same very rejectors of the truth through the swords of His companions, something that I would describe in detail in the next session. But what I am trying to emphasize right now is the fact that these stories of the punishments that the Almighty sent to the respective nations that were visited by messengers, and most part of the description of jihad that you find in the Quran are actually the same theme. It is the same message. This is something that needs to be understood. And I tell you honestly, God has left nothing untried for Him to describe this reality. It is written clearly, and yet it is not read properly. Somebody asked me, that you should raise this question. Why did God not send down an interpretation of the Quran as well? What was the point in keeping the text intact and letting people interpret it the way they choose to? Well, the brief answer of it, I encouraged him to ask this question so that I could answer it. Brief answer of it is, well, God has not made us as foolish people, as individuals who do not have thinking minds, who cannot take decisions on their own. We are not robots who are just given a script to go through. We are independent, intelligent agents who are going through the trial of this life. On the one hand, He has given a book of guidance, and on the other hand, He has given us the liberty to make an attempt to understand it. You want to understand it properly, you will make an attempt, and you will keep doing it as best as you can. You don't want to understand it. God doesn't want you to understand it. It's your choice. So this life is a trial, and God doesn't impose. The last thing that I would like to say in this session is that there has been a result, quite apart from the result that I'll talk about in the next session, as a consequence of the incorrect understanding of these verses. Because these verses are probably, they consume most part of the Quranic text. Is so many times repeated. And I'm sure that people who read them, they keep wondering what could be the possible reason. So because many people weren't able to find out and discern the right understanding of it, they ended up with a wrong understanding of it, which is probably this couldn't be avoided, but it's a double fault. The wrong understanding of these verses that people quite often mention is that because God punished the nations who rejected the message of the messengers through natural calamities, therefore, wherever natural calamities appear, it's God's punishment. If the northern areas of Pakistan in the year 2004-2005, there was an earthquake and people got killed, these were dirty people, God forbid. If there are floods coming in Pakistan, killing poor people, these are criminals. Assuming thereby that people living in Islamabad, Lahore and Karachi are all pious, and these poor farmers who are killed as a consequence of floods are criminals. I remember there were a few Sri Lankan ladies who told me that as a consequence of a tsunami in Sri Lanka, most of the people who got killed were Muslims. That was the Almighty's will. And she said that, it was so tragic that on the one hand, we Muslims were picking the bodies of our dear ones, and on the other hand, there were some devout Muslims with banners that this is the azab of the Almighty, the punishment of the Almighty. And that's not true. Baba, everybody dies in this world through illness, through accident, through some means. Is everything a punishment? Not at all. This is an absolutely wrong, absurd understanding. I mean, natural calamities come normally the way they come. And like individuals die of cancer, of heart attack, of accident, people die in big numbers as well sometimes, which is another form of the Almighty taking souls away from this world. It has got nothing to do with punishments. The punishments that have been described in the Quran are the punishments that he has mentioned are given, are sent to people because God would punish those who reject his messengers in this world. And for that purpose, there is a Quranic verse which is decisive, which is verse 15 of Surah 17, Surah Bani Israel or Barat, verse 15. The Almighty says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ, and we never send azab, punishment, hatta nab'atha rasula, until such time we send a messenger. The Quran is absolutely clear. That is, if there is a calamity which comes without a messenger delivering the message of God directly preceding it, then it is one of those things that keep happening in life. There are trials and tribulations of good times and of tough times that we all go through. But punishment has got to be preceded by a message getting delivered in unmistakable way, which enables the addressees to know that the truth is there for them to accept, and yet they don't accept it. So what I have tried to put across in this session is that the Almighty has a law which he has mentioned in the Quran again and again, which says that if his Rasul messengers come with his message to a nation and the people reject that message, then the nation is going to be punished, eliminated from the face of this earth through one way or the other. In most cases, it was done through natural calamities, but it is also possible to happen through the military might of the companions of the messengers. Just one last point that came to my mind, that it is not just the companions of the last messenger, may Allah's mercy be on him, who were required to eliminate people as a punishment of the Almighty. In the case of Musa alayhi salam also, you find in the Quran and you find in the Bible as well, that when some of them committed practical apostasy, they started worshipping a calf in the absence of Musa alayhi salam. The punishment that the Almighty announced for them was, uqtulu anfusakum, kill your own people. And it's mentioned as something like 3,000 people who were killed, belonging to the children of Israel. Why? Because of the same rule. When the messenger is there, and you have received the message of God through the messenger directly, and then you disbelieve, then you don't deserve to survive anymore. You are killed as a punishment, either through natural calamities or through the swords of the companions of the messenger. May the Almighty enable us to understand the Quran properly.